Hello and welcome to this new webinar in our leadership series, The Journey, How the Arts, Creativity and Storytelling Can Unlock Profound Insight for Everyone. I'm here today with Paul Williamson, author and Head of Talent Development Ambassador Theatre Group, and we're going to explore the inspiration behind his book, Pheasant Dreams, and leadership and coaching lessons for those dealing with today's challenges in their work environment and life. So let's have a quick preview of that. It's beautifully illustrated also by Paul Williamson, who wrote the story and illustrated. So Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, Fiona.
Great. So I'll hand over to you in just a minute, but let's just consider what this book is about, if you can shed some light on that, and what's the inspiration behind it. So Paul, over to you. Let's enjoy the journey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the book's called Pheasant Dreams, and it's about a young boy called Gare, and it opens with him having stories read to him by his nan, but he's feeling really uneasy, and he opens up to his grandmother and talks about the fact that he doesn't feel like he fits in, like I think many of us have felt in the past, that he doesn't fit in at school, that there's something wrong with him, I suppose, and that he doesn't fit in. And his grandmother is very reassuring. What then follows is a dreamlike adventure, really, where Gare meets a very colourful pheasant, who's a wonderful character, who similarly feels quite vulnerable and lonely, and they become friends, and the pheasant takes Gare on a journey into quite a dark wood, but on their journey they meet three significant characters, if you like. So the first is an actor, and then he meets an illustrator, and then he meets a composer who works with a full orchestra. And each of these characters really have a lesson for young Gare that he takes away from each of these encounters. And really, it's a story about friendship. It's about compassion and love. And it's full of small, beautiful moments, I think, of connection, really. And really, it's about how we and Gare can follow our dreams and our passions, really, and find out who we really are. So by the end of the story, Gare is more himself, and he finds real reassurance in the fact that, you know, he can find light in the darkness, I suppose. And so that's the main story, I suppose. The inspiration, I think, for that whole story, if you like, has been a lot of the influences in my life around the arts. So those three characters are really key, and how creativity can really show so much for ourselves. And certainly within coaching and within leadership development, creativity can be a real aid for self-expression and self-awareness. So, Fiona, I think you're on mute at the moment.
So, Paul, you were just telling us about the three characters. You work in the creative sector in the theatre world. But a lot of people wouldn't think creativity was particularly relevant to their day job and how they manage people and how they organise themselves on a daily basis and lead a team. Can you just give us a bit of insight about these characters and how those different areas described that they represent can be brought into everyday life in the management world?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the genesis of this book, to a large extent, was a part of my coaching training, actually. So I studied with the Academy of Executive Coaching, and the question you get asked on their practitioner diploma is to answer two questions. The first is, who am I? And the second is, how am I going to coach? So I remember that process of you have to come up with your own model for coaching as well. And I found it a really difficult process, actually. And I had to dig very deep into, what makes me who I am, I suppose, looking at identity and all sorts of things, really. And from that, I realized that there were these key areas in my life, so my passions, if you like. And I remember planting various words on a big sheet of A3. And the words that came through were music. So I love classical film music. I always have done from a very early age. And the idea of what music could bring. So in the coaching world, that relates to actually listening skills, listening to a full orchestra, listening to the layers. Then I'd also written down the word art. That's a very important part of my life. Again, going right back to childhood. The first thing I ever wanted to be was an artist. My mum was quite arty, and we used to sit together and draw. And I remember from a really early age wanting to be as good at art as my mum. So art was a really important part. And I think, working in the coaching world, what you see, the visual side of things, is also really important. What you're reading in terms of body language, how you see the world, but also using art within coaching can be really useful as well. So you can sometimes use a piece of artwork or an image. We often have coaching cards that we can use that can prompt conversation or associations. So art was a big part of this. Performance was another part. So for that, it's the kind of, within a business setting, we're all required to perform, aren't we? We have performance reviews. That word is used all over the place. So performance is really important, both on the stage, but within business and within the coaching world. So that became a key feature. And storytelling. So actually, we all need to know our own stories and tell stories. I think, in terms of the area that I work in at the Ambassador Theatre Group, ATG, it's all about stories on our stages. But I think every leader has their own story. And some of it's good and some of it's bad. And some of it can influence positively and some of it can influence negatively. So I think there is this onus on all of us, really, to get to grips with what our story is and what our narrative is. And equally, a company, a business will have a story as well. So when I planted those words, I realized that actually they spelt out maps. So music, art, performance, storytelling. And that became my coaching model. Right. So we get to the pandemic. We're in lockdown. There's obviously I also had a period of time where I was furloughed for a while. So I wasn't doing my day job, if you like. And I'd always wanted to write a book. And I loved illustrating as well. So I decided to use my coaching model as a basis for this story. So I used maps, although I reversed the order. So in fact, it's spam. So I started with the storytelling at the beginning with the Nan and Gare. Incidentally, the picture is of my real grandmother, so it is my Nan. who I have very fond memories of reading me Sinbad stories when I was a young boy. And she had a beautiful sing-song voice, which I loved. So I wanted to capture that. So it's a very personal book. So it starts with storytelling, then it moves to performance with the actor. And I think acting as well, you know, you might say, well, what's that got to do with me if I work in a totally different business? I'm not in theatre. But there's an interesting process, actually. I did theatre studies at university, and studying different acting methods, if you like. I remember Stanislavski, for example, which was the beginnings of the, you know, method acting, which became Lee Strasberg's work in America. You know, when people always talked about, well, what's my motivation? You know, why am I doing this? And if you think about that as a question, that's a pretty good question for us all to be asking ourselves, no matter what field we are. You know, what's my motivation? And there's this whole process within naturalistic acting where you kind of go on a journey to discover the character, so to find the character. And I think in many ways, that's what I'm often helping people do via coaching or via leadership development. It's not about trying to be someone else. Actually, the best leaders that I've come across are those people that are authentically themselves. So they're not pretending. It's genuine. And they know what their core values are. They know what drives them. So that's a really important part of this journey, I think, that we're all on. So yeah, the acting part is around that. And I think art in the book, there's a moment where, you know, the artist, there's an accident and basically some tea is spilt. And it's like, what do you do when things go wrong? And I think we've, you know, as adults, that happens all the time, doesn't it? Things go wrong in life. And actually the lesson from the artist in the book is about, well, you know, we can't change the fact that this tea has been spilt, but what can we creatively do with that accident? How do we still retain our resourcefulness? So again, these little lessons are kind of peppered throughout the text, and I think they can relate to children, so children can read it and understand that. But equally, as an adult, I would say, like, this is a children's book suitable for adults, because I think the lessons are applicable to us all, really, about you know, how we manage things like accidents when things go wrong, how we keep calm. And there's even a little reference in that to the elephant and the rider, which is, I don't know whether any of you have read this book, which is the Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. But in it, he talks about the elephant and the rider, which is this whole concept of the kind of limbic system, which is our emotional system, that is the elephant, that can sometimes get out of control. And that's when we might have an emotional reaction to something going wrong. Yeah. And the rider is the neocortex, so the part of our brain that that has access to rational thought, that can calm down and kind of see context and get perspective and make rational decisions. So within the book, there's even a little reference to that around neuroscience, because I learned that along the way from a wonderful coach called Sheila Campbell-Lloyd, who runs brilliant sessions on neuroscience, which I would highly recommend. So there's little references, I think, that adults can pick up throughout the book to kind of point you in directions of, you know, greater learning and greater self-awareness.
And along the way, those things you were talking about, with such huge talent shortages in most sectors, developing and understanding the stories and the ways of working of young people or new recruits and employees and inducting them is all fitted into that, as you were basically saying, what is their story, and getting them to feel comfortable in the environment you're.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the lessons towards the end of the book, when Gare meets the composer, who's stood in front of a full orchestra. And I think what the orchestra represents in many ways is diversity of thought, diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, all of those things. Because if you think about an orchestra, it's made up of different sections, and they're often playing different notes, if you like, but they're collaborating, and each voice is important, and each voice is given a chance to be heard within an orchestral palette. So a symphony orchestra, if you think of it and break it down, like percussion, for example, a drum beat. And if you think about this as well, you can start to think about, well, what are your preferences? So many of us in business are like the drummers.
Mm.
You know, we're keeping pace. It can be quite fast paced, and you're expecting people to follow you. But if you're just banging the drums endlessly, that's quite hard to listen to for prolonged periods of time. Yeah. Then you've got the brass section, which is loud and confident. And that's the vision, isn't it? Within an orchestra, but it can be a vision within an organization about, well, this is where we're heading, folks. Are you with me? It can be heroic, but it can also be loud, and it can drown out other voices in the orchestra, can't it? And then you've got the woodwind, I think, which is a wonderful kind of, to me, the woodwind's like ideas, you know, it flutters. If you think about like the oboes and the, you know, and there are people within your organization who might have quieter voices, but they might have the very, very best ideas. So it's how do we listen to the woodwind and not drown them out? And then, of course, you've got the strings, and the strings to me is more about emotion. It's about relationships. It's about getting on. It's about reading different atmospheres and emotions within rooms. So, yeah, the orchestra can be a wonderful metaphor, I think, for organizational life. And it's also this whole idea of, well, you know, the orchestra, it gives equal time. Well, it gives time for each of those voices to be heard. So it's really important, and it's about listening, isn't it?
And giving people confidence, as you say, to be their instrument to hear, which may be over many stages of people's working life.
Absolutely, and it'll be varied stories as well. So we're doing more work now with Salma Shah, as a wonderful coach and facilitator, looking at also, well, people within a workforce also have often very different lived experience. So people will have different stories, and it can add so much to the richness, like our orchestra. You know, one single instrument is interesting, but if you have a full orchestra, you've got such a much richer palette, I suppose, to listen to and hear, and it makes the final product so much more engaging, doesn't it, to hear all of the colour of a full orchestra.
So it all sounds very complicated, and to those who are new to music or joining an orchestra, it is complicated. But so is life, and so are managing organisations and people's roles within them. So that's a really very useful analogy, I think.
Yeah, and I think the orchestra can represent a whole organisation, but equally it could represent, if you think about your team, if you're a leader, you know, well, do you have the full complement? Have you got a diverse voices within your team? Because if everyone's playing the same instrument, the same notes, you could be missing out on quite a lot. So I think there's kind of systems within systems that you can start to think about. And I just think it's a great analogy to give a kind of different take on it. It's equally, you can ask the question of your team, what music are we making? Yeah, as a creative exercise. Or sometimes you can even ask people to choose pieces of music to represent their work. I mean, that can be fascinating. We've done things like that.
Fascinating. So what about your hero character, the pheasant? How
Oh,
did he come about? Why the pheasant, and what does he represent for you?
well,
Sitting there on your shoulder, I see.
yeah, I've brought my pheasant along with me. So pheasants, I've always loved pheasants. Going back to childhood, when I used to read Danny, the Champion of the World, so Roald Dahl story, which is all about they there's lots of pheasants in that story basically, and I remember reading it to my children, and so I really liked pheasants, and I wanted to, and I love the way they look. They're really colourful, aren't they? So I remember drawing pheasants, and then I started to think a bit more about, well, what do they represent? And actually, if you look at, there's various websites that will tell you like the symbolic meaning of various animals. And actually, when I looked into it, pheasants represent, among other things, they represent creativity, and they represent passion. So I was like, oh yes, that fits beautifully into this story that I'm trying to craft. So the pheasant became kind of front of center. I remember I shared an initial kind of draft and some sketches with somebody, a friend of mine, and that person turned around to me and said, "Oh God, pheasants! You know, they're such stupid animals. They kind of stay in the middle of the road and get run over, or like they fly into the sky and people can easily shoot them. Why have you chosen a pheasant?" It stopped me in my tracks for a moment, thinking, well, yeah, maybe I have chosen the wrong animal here. But then I thought about it some more, and actually, if a pheasant represents creativity, actually, it's also very vulnerable, isn't it?
Mm.
And there's a naivety to this bird, if you like. So it flies into the air in a naive way, I suppose. And that's sometimes what it's like, I think, if I liken it to, personal life. If you share something of yourself, so if you actually, even sharing my book, to a certain degree, it's a vulnerable thing to do, isn't it? You put your heart and soul into something and then you let it go, knowing that, some people might try and shoot it down. And I think this happens quite a lot in life, generally speaking. So there's an image I quite like to share, if I may, Fiona, because it relates to this. So this is a picture I've done. It's not in the book, but I wrote a blog about this because to me, I think this is what happens in organizational life quite a lot. So imagine you're sat around a table having a meeting, and there's different statuses in terms of the people around that table, as there often is. And maybe there's a new person within that team, and they make a decision to share an idea or a thought that they've had. And I would liken this to this picture. So it's the equivalent to releasing this colorful pheasant, this naive pheasant into the ether, essentially. Now, what happens next, I think, is critical to creating psychologically safe environments for people to be at their best. And I've seen this handled brilliantly, and I've seen this handled, really badly. And it tends to be, so someone releases their idea, their pheasant, it flies into the air, and then someone's there with a gun to say, bang, oh no, we tried that back in 2005 and it didn't work. Bang. And you know what? If that happens, sometimes it only has to happen once for somebody to completely lose their confidence and never share an idea again. Because I think it relates back to childhood. And so there's always a point, I think, in childhood where we're told, no, that's no good. You can't draw. You're no good at this. And it might be from a teacher, or it might be from another child. But, we carry that kind of stuff forward. So I think that I'm really passionate about this idea of actually we need to be creating safe spaces in our schools, in our workplaces as well, to allow people to share more. So rather than saying yes, but, can we say yes and? So can we build on people's ideas so that we don't kind of crush them and diminish them? Because I think there's a lot riding on this stuff.
And do you have a little tip for doing that if you observe that? I mean, it's all about dialogue, isn't it, as well? And knowing where you are in the room and what your role is within.
Yeah, and it's a key leadership challenge, Fiona, as well, because so for example, if you are the most senior person in the room, if you speak first and you share your ideas first, the chances are that will shut down any ideas because people are saying, oh, well, that's what they've decided. I had an idea, but no. So one of the biggest lessons actually for leaders, and I think it's contrary to a lot of old notions of what leaders should be. You know, that old militaristic idea of a leader leading from the front and you know, rallying the troops sometimes works against us as leaders. So I think the opposite is just to create a safe space for other people to talk and talk little and preferably towards the end. So set the scene, ask a question, and then welcome and encourage what comes back. I think it's just a key part of creating safe, creative environments for people to explore things and share ideas.
Well, thank you very much. That's wonderful. And I imagine the boy holding the feather is that little reminder of keep going.
Yeah, keep going. And to know yourself, I think. So this goes back to the storytelling part of it. So you do need to know your story, I think, and know your narrative and what's important to you. So to me, the idea of creativity and the lessons from those three creative characters, if you like, is what I hold dear. So in those darker moments when potentially my creative, relaxed brain might be diminished, that's when I'll reach for the feather. And that's the idea of, well, I know who I am, I know what my values are, and to remind myself of that in the moment so that you can be purposeful in what you do.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was really very enlightening. And I'm sure people will enjoy reading the book.
Thank you.
So that was a fascinating conversation, I'm sure you'll agree, with Paul Williamson. And here are details about him. He talked about his career in the theatre at Ambassador Theatre Group, and also managing and supporting people in the workplace. And Paul is also a coach, as he mentioned. I'm Fiona Murchie, the managing editor and founder of Relocate Global and Think Global People. And we are continually bringing forward different ways of helping to manage people and international people throughout careers in workplaces around the world. So do keep in touch with our media. And if you'd like to get hold of Paul's book, Pheasant Dreams, he has a website, pheasantdreams.com, and the book is available via Amazon and bookshops. And Paul will be pleased to hear from you with comments. Relocate Global is a multimedia with a range of resources, including a digital magazine, newsletters, webinars and podcasts, country guides, education and school support, events and awards. So please do dip into our resources and join us for the next webinar or podcast in this series. Thank you for joining us.